Hello everyone. So here we see a world map showing the different types of democracy, and that's our topic for this lecture. Many of us will be most familiar with presidential democracy, which you can see here on the map in dark blue. The US is obviously a presidential democracy, as are most of the states in the Americas. Outside of the Americas, however, presidential democracy is rare. If we look at Europe, the geographic region with the highest concentration of democracies, we see a lot more gray, particularly in Western Europe. This represents parliamentary democracy, a system with a very different arrangement of the executive and legislative apparatus of the state. We're going to talk about these two major systems today and pit them against one another. Both have their advantages and their disadvantages. We'll also talk about a third type. You can see that third type in the diagonal blue stripes. That's semi-presidentialism, which is an attempt to compromise between presidential and parliamentary democracy. So what are we talking about when we use these terms? To understand that, let's make sure we get the distinction between executives and legislatures. Basically, this is the distinction between making the laws or legislating them and enacting or executing the laws. All regimes have an executive. It's the most basic form of government. The executive is the boss. In non-democratic states, the executive will typically have control over the legislative function of the state as well. However, democracies always feature a legislature that makes the laws and limits the authority of the executive. The question is, how should these functions be separated? And what should the relationship be between these branches? That's the difference we're talking about today. Also, before delving into the details of these different kinds of democracies, let's draw a distinction between two types of executive. There are these two broad executive functions, that of the head of state and that of the head of government. This goes back to our basic distinction between states and governments. Remember, the state is that more abstract legal entity, while the government is the more concrete group of people who have the authority to lead the state. The head of state and government correspond to these roles. Think of this kind of like the distinction between the soul and the body. The head of state is the soul. This person represents the state. It's a figurehead who is meant to unite all citizens of the state and to be the face of the state both domestically and in international relations. The head of government is more like the body of the state. Here the executive function is the actual day-to-day business of the state, governing. The head of government is the head of the cabinet, that group of individuals who represent all of the various departments or ministries that run the state. With these distinctions now cleared up, let's turn to the form of democracy most of us are used to, presidential democracy. Here's a little overview of how presidential democracy works. Basically, there are separate elections for the legislature and the executive. So the legislature, that being what we would call in the United States the Congress, and then the president, the executive. Thus, in November, Americans go to the polls and they cast separate ballots for each of these. And indeed, this is the essence of presidential democracy, the separation of powers. Separation of powers here is the separation of the executive and legislative powers, each embodied in a separate political institution that independently receives a mandate from the people via elections. The legislature and the executive in presidential democracies are also not linked to one another's survival. Each has its own term limits, and they can't fire one another outside of the very rare circumstances of a successful presidential impeachment. Each branch has its own powers, and they check one another, serving as watchdogs, and each jealously guarding their own constitutionally provided powers. But while the legislative and executive functions are separated in the presidential democracy, the two executive functions we just discussed are fused. So the president in a presidential democracy is both the head of state and the head of government. Regardless of tie color, these roles are fused and it's the same person. So that's presidential democracy, which is intuitive to most of us. Now let's get crazy and examine a parliamentary democracy. So here you can see the outlines of power in a parliamentary democracy. At election time, the voters go to the polls and they vote for the legislature. So they select candidates or parties to go to Parliament to represent them. Note that they generally do not directly elect an executive. They only elect members of Parliament. After the elections, the members of Parliament form a government. That is, they elect the Prime Minister and they approve the cabinet officials. Therefore, the executive branch comes out of the legislature. So unlike in a presidential system, the executive and legislative branches are codependent. Also unlike the presidential system, the executive functions are split. Whereas the president in a presidential democracy is both head of state and head of government, in a parliamentary system, these are separate offices. The head of state is generally either a monarch or, confusingly, a president. This is a largely ceremonial position. This person is meant to embody the state, to be nonpartisan, to be a unifying figure that represents the state as a whole and goes to lots of official functions. In the United Kingdom and many other European states, this is a monarch. Here you see Queen Elizabeth II, the head of the United Kingdom, and also the head of state in a few former British colonies, such as Canada and Australia. The head of government has the real power in a parliamentary democracy. This office is usually called the Prime Minister. Here you can see the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron. The head of government is elected by Parliament and does most of the things we associate with the executive leading the country. Unlike the head of state, who is nonpartisan and largely stays out of policymaking, the head of government is a partisan figure, a career politician whose job is to get into the nitty-gritty of policymaking. He or she proposes the laws to Parliament and leads the cabinet of ministers or secretaries at the top of the government organizations and bureaucracies. So to recap, you can see that voters elect members of Parliament, the legislature, who then in turn elect the actual government, the executive branch. As you can see by the arrow on the right there with the question mark, sometimes voters elect the head of state in these systems, and when the head of state is elected, they're usually called a president. But a lot of the time the head of state is hereditary or an otherwise non-elected position. And even if they are elected, so even if the voters elect the head of state, the president, it's a mainly ceremonial task, so the real executive power is actually in the hands of the head of government. Forming a government out of Parliament isn't always a straightforward task. Many states have more than two major political parties, which means that one party will rarely win 50% of the seats in Parliament. After a parliamentary election, the ceremonial head of state invites the winning party, that party with the most seats in Parliament, to form a government. If that party has a majority, it simply forms a government alone. But this is not actually that common, and usually the dominant party is the largest but still falls short of a majority. Therefore, the party needs to form a coalition, a combination of two or more political parties that will work together to form a government. Forming a coalition can be pretty tricky business. It is generally the result of an intricate bargaining process in which the dominant party and potential coalition partners hammer out the sorts of policies that they would have and divvy out the key ministerial positions of power. Though the dominant party almost always gets the prime minister's position, other very important positions such as the minister or secretary of state can often go to coalition partners. Indeed, potential coalition partners are actually in a great position of power many times, and small parties can often be what we'll call kingmakers, as when the dominant party cannot form a government, the head of state may go back and ask the second largest party in Parliament to have a try at forming a coalition. So the small parties are kingmakers in that they can actually sometimes choose the next government. So think of this situation. Following the parliamentary elections in this country, the party of the right is the biggest parliamentary faction with 44% of the seats in Parliament, while the party of the left is nipping at its heels with 42%. There's also a centrist party that's way back in third place with only 14% of the seats in Parliament. However, to make a government, one of the two major parties will need to form a coalition, and the obvious partner will be that third party in the center, since it has more in common with either the left or the right than the left or the right have with one another. So, when the head of state of this country asks the right to form a government, the right will approach the center and they will bargain over policies of their potential coalition, as well as the makeup of the cabinet. If the right and the center can't agree, and they can't get a majority in Parliament, the head of state will then invite the left to try and form a government. Then the left will approach the center, and they will engage in a bargaining session. So you can see why these small parties are often called kingmakers. They can sometimes basically decide who will be the prime minister. Of course, in some circumstances, all of this will fail, and one of the two major parties will end up forming a minority government alone. Whether or not this is feasible depends a lot on the specific rules and institutions of that state and the partisan makeup of Parliament. So we'll just note that it happens sometimes, but here we're not going to worry too much about the details. So in parliamentary systems, the executive basically comes out of the legislature. the branches are quite intertwined. They are also held highly accountable to one another and are codependent. In a parliamentary system, elections can occur between the terms. There is usually a maximum limit of time that can pass without an election, say 4 or 5 years on average, but within that time period, there can be new elections. If the Prime Minister chooses to, he or she can usually dissolve Parliament. This essentially means all of the members of Parliament have to run for election. Likewise, if the Parliament is displeased with the Prime Minister and his or her government, they can pass a vote of no confidence. This entails a majority of the members of Parliament voting against the government, or simply voting against a major piece of the government's legislation. When this occurs, the government falls, and the Prime Minister loses his or her position. There might be renegotiations to form a new government out of Parliament as it stands, or there simply may be new elections. So you can see that if the Parliament is dissolved by the Prime Minister, or if the Parliament passes a vote of no confidence, there can be elections not based on every 4 years, like the regular presidential elections that we're used to, but it can be quite irregular. So, now we have a grasp of the basic contours of these two systems, so the question becomes, which is better? Which of these two systems is more democratic? Well, naturally, there is no direct answer to that question. These two basic forms of democracy each have their own advantages as well as disadvantages. So let's take them in turn, starting with the presidential system's advantages. So, first of all, the president is directly elected. So that means the executive is directly elected. That's good. People are sure about the ramifications of their vote for president because they mark that person's name on the ballot, unlike in a parliamentary system where the person who becomes prime minister can be the result of a bargaining process. So one's vote might have unintended consequences. Presidential systems also provide more horizontal accountability. That is, the separation of powers means there are more veto players. The legislative and executive branches provide checks and balances, and each is wary of the other. Thus, no one actor has an enormous amount of power. This means that policy changes will tend to be more gradual, and finally, the term limits in the presidential system allow for more stability of government. You know after the president is elected, that president will be there for 4 years. Let's turn to the cons. Well, there's a very prominent political scientist named Juan Linz who wrote a very influential piece called The Perils of Presidentialism. So as you can guess from that title, his argument is that presidential democracy is much more problematic than parliamentary democracy. So let's think about some of his reasons. Well, one thing that should be obvious to many Americans right now is that the separation of powers in presidential democracy can produce gridlock in cases of divided government. That is, when the president is of one party and the majorities in Congress are of another party. This has played out rather dramatically in the United States in recent memory, with the president and Congress basically trying to play a game of chicken with one another. Presidential democracies can also involve what Linz dubs dueling legitimacy. So this means that both branches of the government claim to have the legitimacy of the people's support, even when they are directly opposed to one another. So the two sides, the president and the Congress, can each say, well, I was elected, I speak for the people want what I want. And they both have a legitimate claim to that because they were both put in place by elections. Linz also argues that the fixed term limits in a presidential system are too rigid. Thus, no matter how much everyone hates a president, he or she stays in office the entire term, barring some very unusual circumstances that would invoke impeachment. The office of the president can also produce a winner-take-all kind of political competition because the president is such an important single office. Moreover, the president can legitimately claim to speak for the people, a circumstance which may tempt them to try and consolidate their power. So there are some political scientists who argue that presidential democracy is more likely to slide back towards dictatorship, with the president trying to consolidate his or her power to become a dictator. So what are the good things about parliamentary democracy? Well, because the prime minister has a majority in parliament usually, policy can be made much more quickly than in a presidential system. If the prime minister is in place, it kind of means by definition that he or she has the votes of parliament, and that's what's necessary to get laws passed. Thus, gridlock is virtually weeded out by the basic rules of parliamentary democracy. Indeed, the ability of a prime minister to dissolve parliament, or of the parliament to recall a prime minister with a vote of no confidence, also means that there's a lot more flexibility. If everyone hates the prime minister, then he or she can simply be fired. Finally, in systems that often require coalition governments, bargaining over these governments and the inclusion of multiple partisan viewpoints in these governments means that there can be more compromise, and minorities can be represented more fairly. On the other hand, coalition governments can be hard to form in the first place. It sometimes happens that nobody is able to form a coalition after elections, and if a minority government is not feasible, there may have to be new elections before a government can be put in place. So you can have long periods in parliamentary democracies where there is no government, and that's obviously bad. Moreover, the chief executive is not directly elected in parliamentary governments. Thus, there is more uncertainty in how the final shape of the government will actually look, as its composition is typically the result of bargaining behind closed doors after an election. Whereas when you vote for a presidential candidate, you know that if that person wins, he or she will take power. In a parliamentary system, your candidate or party might go into a surprising coalition. Finally, the same rules that give parliamentary systems their flexibility can also cause instability. The Prime Minister's ability to dissolve Parliament or the Parliament's ability to pass a vote of no confidence can mean that there is quick turnover of governments. Finally, the fact that the Prime Minister's government can pass rapid policy changes means that there may be instability in terms of the laws of government, with the laws of the land switching back and forth dramatically with every new government. So we see that we have both significant advantages and disadvantages for both of these systems. This is a very important debate, as democracy has been spreading and young democracies must make the decision as to what kind of institutional arrangement they should adopt for their democracy. Still, these institutions do not exist in vacuums, and there are other political institutions as well as societal factors that will really affect how these outcomes work. The party system, which we will examine in a future lecture, is particularly important, and that is largely determined by both electoral laws and the makeup of society. For instance, where there are many parties, parliamentarism means that there will be more negotiation because we will always need a coalition government to rule. However, where there are only two parties in a parliamentary system, and elections typically produce a party in parliament with a majority, as was largely the case in the United Kingdom until the elections of 2010, a parliamentary system can completely block out the need for compromise. Thus, depending on the party system as well as other institutions, a parliamentary system can be more or less prone to compromise than a presidential system. So often it's not a question of which is better overall, the presidential or parliamentary system. Perhaps in many cases it's which is better for a state specifically, or which is better in addition to other institutional arrangements. Alright, to conclude, let's take up one last institutional arrangement, semi-presidential democracy. Whereas the two main flavors of democracy are hundreds of years old, dating back to the political development of the United States and the United Kingdom respectively, semi-presidentialism is a relatively new invention coming out of the Constitution of the French Fifth Republic in the middle of the 20th century. Its basic contours look much like parliamentarism, with the election of members of Parliament, and then Parliament electing a Prime Minister to form a government. The major difference, however, is that the President in a semi-presidential democracy is always directly elected, and unlike the head of state in a parliamentary regime, the Queen or the President, this President is a really powerful figure. Thus, there are two executives with significant power. The balance of power between the Prime Minister and the President in these systems is very different from state to state depending on the specifics of the Constitution. Typically, the President is the stronger of the two, but sometimes that's not the case. So does this system adopt all of the advantages of the other two systems without any of their disadvantages? Well, not really. The two executives can be really confusing. When they are of the same party, the government functions quite efficiently and actually is much like a parliamentary democracy with easy lawmaking and rapid policy changes. When the two executives are political opponents, however, they can cause massive gridlock and instability. A lot of how it actually plays out depends on the specifics of the individual constitution within the state. For example, in the mother of semi-presidential systems, France, the president is much stronger and usually wins out. However, in other cases, many of which are in post-communist Europe, the president is more like the head of state in a parliamentary system, and the system as a whole thus functions more like a parliamentary system. Alright, well that was a lot, and that is all for now. I really appreciate your attention. There's a lot going on here, so you might need to re-watch or reread portions that are unclear. Also, make sure to get in touch if you have questions as soon as you can. So, good luck and goodbye.